Kara, welcome back to the Storybox podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me back.
It's honestly a real privilege to be able to have another conversation with you. Your last conversation that we had, I had a feeling that it would do really well, and it did extremely well. A lot of people were commenting about how much they really, really enjoyed what you had to say. So I am grateful for this time. So it means you're really popular amongst my audience. And we
Oh, no,
said, sorry, what was that?
I just said that's so nice. Thank you.
I mean, why wouldn't anyone love what you have to say? I mean, it's common sense, and which seems to be not so common these days. So when anyone comes on my show that has a great deal of common sense, I love them even more. So, I mean, one of the things that we mentioned that we were going to talk about, which we ran out of time, the last interview, we sort of touched on it a little bit, but feminism. You sort of began describing why you became a feminist in the first place. But for those people that actually don't know who you are, what you do, and why you're a feminist to begin with, would you be able to please explain for the audience?
So I've always thought of myself as a feminist ever since I could remember. I grew up mainly in the 70s and 80s. My mother was a product of the 50s and 60s, and she still considers herself a feminist. And I would also just say that I grew up in what I would consider to be a pretty progressive household, in the sense that my parents shared most domestic responsibilities fairly equally, I would say. And my parents are still together, I'm very happy to say, after 50 something years.
Wow.
And my dad was always, my dad had his own career. He is a doctor. He's a retired doctor now. And he was always very supportive of my mother and her own career pursuits. And I saw that and I really appreciated it. And as I grew up into young adulthood, I studied feminism, and I just thought that it was very important. I studied it in college, and I took some feminist courses in law school. And I ended up taking a career path that was unrelated to feminism, not antithetical to it, just unrelated. I ended up working in what we in America call the progressive criminal justice reform movement. But I never lost my commitment to feminism. And what I'm about to say may be controversial to some of your audience and to you, but part of my commitment to feminism involves a commitment to abortion rights, which I have always believed very strongly in and still do. And none of that ever wavered. And so even though in college and in law school, I was pursuing a lot of different things, my commitment to feminism never waned. And then I spent the next just under 20 years doing criminal justice in the States. And at the end of 2014, a good friend of mine, who is herself a feminist, woke me up to the threats that so-called transgender poses to women and girls as a sex class. And that really reignited my commitment to feminism.
What attracted you to feminism, or the ideas that pertained with feminism in the first place? What was it about it for you?
Well, okay, so this is Storybox. So you want to hear stories?
Yes, please.
So yeah. So when I was in 8th grade, I would say that two things happened so I would be around 13, 14. Two things happened that I think personally cemented my commitment to feminism. One of which was that I had this really great civics and government teacher in 8th grade. His name was Mr. Winter, and he was just an outstanding teacher. And he gave our class an assignment, which was to write to the majority leader of the House of Representatives. That's the top person in the US House. And at the time, it was a man named Thomas O'Neill. And we were to pair up. So we were to get together with a friend, and we were to think of an issue that we cared about. And we were to write a letter to the majority leader of the House of Representatives. Great assignment for 13-year-olds, right? Like, get involved in activism, whatever your issue and whatever your position, get involved. So my friend and I wrote a letter to him about a law in the US that is still on the books that says that the federal government, that it says no federal monies can be used for abortion. And again, whatever anyone thinks on abortion, I don't want to fight about that. I'm just saying that my friend and I thought, well, Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. And if women, it was at the time, if women with money can access abortion services, then poor women ought to be able to as well. So the letter that we wrote to the majority leader of the House of Representatives made that argument. And so that was one of my first sort of entries into political activism as a 13-year-old. And that required us to research the issue and really think hard about the issue. It was just a great assignment for a 13-year-old, for a class of 13-year-old kids. Another thing that happened that same year, I'm very sorry to say, is that my mother's youngest sister was murdered by her husband. He had shot her to death and then shot himself to death. And she was, I think, 25 years old at the time. And that was a very difficult thing for my family to go through, obviously. And it made me think a lot about male violence against women. And it made me look at the issue. It forced me to look at the issue and to think hard about the number of women who were murdered by men in this country. I believe that until recently, it was 3 to 4 American women were murdered by men every day, literally every day. And then under lockdown, that number skyrocketed to around 5 women murdered by their, and this is, I'm sorry, this is not women murdered by men. This is women murdered by their domestic partners, whether husbands or boyfriends. 5 every day. And this rarely gets reported in the news. It's totally unreported story. Nobody seems to care about it. And it made me think really hard about whether our society actually cares about women as human beings. And I concluded that our society does not. And that is what made me a feminist.
Why do you think our society doesn't care about women that much? Is it mainly a male problem, or is it both some females and males?
So that's a really good question. In my own country, I don't think that here in the States, we have ever really considered women to be fully autonomous human beings. And part of why I say that is we've got a provision in our Constitution that requires equal protection of the laws. And it wasn't until 1971 that the United States Supreme Court decided that women are people as a legal matter. Literally, it wasn't until 1971 that women were legally considered to be people for purposes of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And I just think that if our society, whether I'm talking about my country or globally, if we considered women and girls to be full human beings, we would not see exponential rates of sex. What am I thinking? Intentional abortions of female fetuses, infanticide of female infants, the astronomical rates of rape, sexual abuse, and murder that are perpetrated against women and girls all over the world, or porn, frankly. I mean, we just would not see the kinds of porn that we see in terms of how women are depicted and degraded if our society considered women to be actual human beings.
It's 99% of pornographic material depicts some form of violence against a woman, and young men are ingesting that kind of material, and it changes their psyche. It changes the way they view women, changes the way they treat women. I know I was addicted to the rubbish since I was 12 years old, and I noticed how it made me treat the women in my life. It was disgusting, and I did not like that. And I'm glad that I was able to get away from it. So it looks as if like society has created problems for themselves, And I guess my question is, do you see feminism, or why do you see feminism as being sort of like this cure or a way out of, or more or less protecting women from the likes of these? Because women, I know, can treat men poorly too, right?
Sorry, did you say women can treat men poorly too?
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah.
It can be both. Men can treat. I know statistics have said, I guess today and even in the past, that men have done terrible things to women and they continue to do so. But also, some women I know treat men poorly as well. So, how do we fix this issue? Is it more the role of feminism, let's say, or is it more a human issue?
It's true. I personally know a guy who has told me some horrific stories about how his mother abused him as a boy and as a young man. And I don't question him at all. I know that that happens. I just go back to the statistics that show that the overwhelming majority of sex-based violence is committed by men against women, which is not to minimize the amount of violence, not sexual violence, but physical violence. And in this country, especially gun violence, that is perpetrated by men against men, right? That's a really important thing. And I don't mean for that to get lost. But to your point, it's true that some women do treat men very badly. I guess I just go back to Margaret Atwood's adage that, and I'm paraphrasing, for the most part, men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them. And I just think that that remains true. And so for me, feminism is an important political movement, by which I mean my primary interests is for the rights, privacy, and safety and dignity of women and girls as a sex class. And that's why this whole trans thing becomes important. It's not to say that I'm not concerned about the welfare of men and boys. I am. And in the trans context, that particularly comes up with boys and young men who are harming themselves, as girls and young women, more girls and young women than boys and young men. But I'm totally sympathetic to the plight of the boys and young men who have been caught up in this. And they deserve just as much care and remedy and medical health treatment to help them, medical and mental health treatment to help them accept themselves as boys and men. So it's not that I'm unsympathetic to the plight of boys and men in our society. I've got men that I care about, many men that I care about in my life. It's more just that as a political movement, feminism is focused on women and girls as a sex class. And that's what I've chosen to focus on at this point in my life and in my career.
Have you foreseen, or do you see in today's day and age, any flaws within feminism?
Plenty.
Would you be able to explain some of those flaws that you've seen?
So when I talk about feminism, I am talking about the political movement to liberate women and girls from male domination. Now, that specifically is often referred to as radical feminism. 30 years ago, I never felt the need to refer to myself as any particular type of feminist. I knew that I was a feminist, but I hadn't really done thinking, and I didn't really feel emotionally invested in caring about what kind of feminist I was. I knew about various types. I knew there's socialist feminists, environmentalist feminists, liberal feminists, I studied all of that and I knew all about it, but it wasn't my chief concern. And in more recent years, I have decided that it is very important for me to call myself a radical feminist, because when I refer to feminism, what I mean is radical feminism. But what passes for feminism in America and in many other places is something that I don't recognize as feminism at all. It's the type of so-called feminism that advances the idea that, quote, sex work is work, the idea that pornography is empowering, the idea that we should all feel very empowered by wanting our boyfriends to do horrible things to us during sex. I mean, it really, really bothers me. But that kind of stuff passes as feminism, and I see that as hugely problematic.
That would be considered third wave feminism, right?
Third wave or liberal. But I won't even call it feminism because I don't
Mm.
recognize it as feminism at all.
I don't either. And there's also another, I guess, sect that comes out of these third wave radicals that call themselves feminists that say that every single man is considered vile and evil and should be done away with, which I disagree with completely. I'm all for women being equal. I'm all for sex-based rights. I'm all for that, but I wouldn't consider myself to be a male feminist. I know some others do consider themselves to be that. I just have a high respect for women. Sure, I've failed in the past, but I don't think no one's perfect, right? I think everyone has failed to some degree, but I'm interested more or less in what are these sex-based rights that feminists have been fighting for, let's say, in a political stance for such a long time.
So just to get to your point about whether feminists think all men are evil, one of my favorite things that any radical feminist ever said is Andrea Dworkin, who said, and I'm paraphrasing, if I thought that all men are equal, I wouldn't even bother with this thing called feminism, right?
Mm.
If I thought that you were all evil, I would just write you off. And she has this great quote about how there's a reason that women aren't running around killing men all the time. And the reason is not that there's a shortage of kitchen knives, right? The reason that the
That's a good
reason
one.
is that we believe in men's humanity. Like we believe that men can want to respect women, you know,
Mm.
and there are so many examples of that radical feminists, at the end of the day, radical feminists, perhaps ironically, end up having more faith in men's humanity than many men do. It's really interesting.
Why do you think that's the case?
So that was just to that. Sorry, what was that?
I was curious. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think some women end up having more faith in men's humanity? And then maybe that might help segue into the next part.
Why do I think that? I mean, I guess I don't know. It's an interesting psychological question.
Mm.
I had a boss one time, a guy who he was a very good boss and he was a very nice person. And he would when issues concerning like, you know, the sexes would come up in conversation, he would say things like, I make no excuse for my sex, right? He would say like, he would basically say like, I know men are shit, right? Like, I mean, he didn't say that, but he was speaking as a man and as a father of a boy. And he would denigrate men much more than I would, right? Like I would be like, well, you could actually not be shit.
Comes down to a
I don't know.
choice at the end of the day, I reckon. And also how one is raised. Because I was raised in a loving and nurturing environment. My mum was, I guess, the one that raised me primarily. And so I had this high level of respect and dignity for women. And I saw what they go through a lot of the time. And I just wanted to help as much as I could with my limited ways of helping. And yeah, it is an interesting psychological aspect because you got these radicals that nowadays that promote a harmful idea, but yet they'll turn around and go, "Oh, I don't think that all men are evil. I don't. Please don't. I don't think that." But they're contradicting themselves a lot of the time. So
Yeah.
it's rather fascinating to me. But yeah, going back to the other point that you're trying to make, I think I lost it. Whoops.
Well, I want to just say one more thing before we leave this point, which is that I know a guy who who's a very, very, very nice person, and I know his mother, I don't know his father, but I know that they are still together and have been for a very long time. And I know that he was raised in a very nurturing environment. And he had something very interesting to say on the topic of pornography. And what
Mm.
he said was, I don't want to live in a world where pornography is illegal. I want to live in a world where men do not feel sexually aroused at images of women being degraded. And I've always just appreciated his statement about that.
See, that's interesting because I would be happy for porn to just be done away with because of the harmful nature and harmful effects that it does to a young person's brain. But it's interesting
That's
how. Sorry, go on.
well, that's sort of what he's saying.
Hmm.
That's sort of what he's saying. I mean, he would also be happy to live in a world where porn is done away with. But I think his point is that he would prefer to live in a world where it didn't exist in the first place.
Yeah. That would be a very interesting world because I think a lot of problems have stemmed from pornography for a lot of young men. Yeah, the dangers of porn, I could spend ages talking about it and all the research that I've found that not just the psychological damage, but even the brain and the rewiring it does with the brain, the perception that you have of yourself, and then the way you act around certain people, what you think, what you say, it is really, really damaging. And I was even watching a conversation with Jordan Peterson and Andrew Huberman, and they were talking about the effects that it has on mating. So when you are watching porn, you are desiring to be and you are imagining yourself to be with that other person. And it's almost like you're creating this attachment, psychologically speaking, to this other person. So when you're actually with a real life partner that you claim to love, let's say, and you're watching another person that you're desiring on the other end, when it comes down to the real person, you're no longer desiring her really, you're desiring other people. And so it's just this, and which also leads to that man treating the woman that he's with extremely poorly because he's desiring to be with somebody else. It's an interesting aspect, I find, that society is not really paying much attention to. And those that do warn everyone to say, you should not be watching this. You got the other side that will go, no, 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 it's empowering. It's empowering us to do OnlyFans. We've got control of our bodies, body autonomy and all that sort of stuff. But you're not realizing the harms that it's doing to a lot of young men. So they're my thoughts.
Yeah, it's got absolutely nothing. No, I agree with you, of course. And it has absolutely nothing to do with forming authentic, emotional, respectful, loving relationships with actual human beings.
Which I think is really, really sad. We are created to have connection with each other, especially with the opposite sex as well. You got male and female, which I think is under the trans movement somehow being done away with. I don't understand that side of things. It's fascinating to me how you've got male and female, and then they want to create this sort of in between both. Like it's just so ridiculous. It's not even funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that. It's a little more complicated than that, but yeah, we can talk about that if you want, or we can talk about Dr. Phil,
Yeah.
whatever you want to talk about.
I mean, I was sort of getting off track a little bit, I think. But you were on Dr. Phil not that long ago. And would you be able to share what ended up happening? Was it well received, do you think? And how, like, were you reached out to by Dr. Phil's team and asked to come on? Like, what was the story behind that?
Yeah, so it was July of 2022. And the reason I remember that is because it was my partner's birthday, and we were taking a little trip into Maryland. And it was this tiny little town in Maryland that had like one store, you know, one post office, tiny, tiny little town. And we went into this bar that was a bar that also had pizza. That was all it had. It had like beer and pizza, and that was all. And we sat at the bar and ordered a pizza and drank a beer. And then I went outside, and he was paying for the beer and the pizza. And outside, I was checking my phone, and I had an email from the producers of the Dr. Phil show. And I was like, what? And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And they were inviting a phone call, and I responded immediately and said I'd be happy to have a phone call. And so we did. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, I had several phone calls with the producers, two producers of Dr. Phil. And it took them a while to confirm that I was going to be on the show. They eventually did. And it took them an even longer time to decide who was going to be on the quote pro-trans side, right? I was there to be a TERF, a trans exclusionary radical feminist. That was going to be my job. They didn't say that, but that was the idea. And they needed to have someone who was going to be on the other side, who was going to promote the trans agenda. And at one point, they secured a guy who calls himself sissy, genderqueer, non-binary. I think that's what he calls himself. Anyway, regardless, he's a man, and his name is Jacob Tobia, Tobia, if anyone wants to look him up. So he was going to be on the show. And I was like, great, I would love to debate Jacob Tobia on the topics of sex and gender. That sounds like a lot of fun. And then they told me that when he found out that I was going to be on the other side, he just backed out completely. So that was interesting. And then they couldn't find, yeah. And then they couldn't find anyone. And at one point, I was on the phone with the producers, the head producer, and she said, Kara, it is remarkably difficult to find someone to go up against you on this topic. And I thought that was really funny. But I was also scared that they would pull me from the show for that reason. But they did, to their credit. So they flew me out to Los Angeles in, I'm pretty sure it was August of 2022. So it would have been a year now. I flew to Los Angeles, and it was just really interesting. It was pretty wild, the whole thing. They put me up in this very nice hotel, and they provided my transportation to the studio. We had to get there hours and hours before the show was to tape. And there were very strict COVID protocols for getting into the studio. And so we had to be tested upon entering, which is one thing. And then there was this guy who was assigned to sort of, I don't know, babysit me while I was waiting to get into the studio. And he came out and he said, I'm so sorry, your test is inconclusive. And I was like, okay, but first of all, I've been vaccinated. I know that's a controversial topic. We don't have to fight about vaccinations, but I was vaccinated, and I had tested before I got on the plane. And I was negative before I got on the plane. Anyway, they said the test was inconclusive, so I couldn't come in. I had to take another test. So that was fine. I did. And then I had to wait for that test result. And in the meantime, I'm getting sort of nervous because the taping is kind of approaching. And I know that I've got hair and makeup and clothes and blah, blah, blah. So the test is inconclusive a second time. So I have to take a third test. And finally, I'm negative. So they let me in. And from then it was kind of a blur. The first, well, I had a dressing room. So that was nice. I'd never had a dressing room before. But my dressing room was basically an empty room with a desk and a small mirror on the wall. It was not like a fancy dressing room. There were no fancy lights or anything like that. But I did have a private room to myself, so that was nice. And they had told me to bring clothes that I might want to wear for the taping. So I did. I brought a couple of outfits that I thought might be appropriate. And the first people to come visit me were the wardrobe women. And these women were hilarious. They were so stereotypical. They had tape measures around their necks, and they had these little pin cushions as bracelets with pins stuck in them. And they looked at my outfits that I had displayed on the floor for their consideration, and they were like, maybe this, maybe that. I don't like that. And then they would run into their, I don't know, warehouse area and get these other ideas and bring them and hang them on this little hanging tree thing. And they'd be like, okay, we need to see you in this, we need to see you in that. And then I would put on a new outfit, and then they would come back in and they would be like, and they would point, and I would just be standing there. It was such a weird thing. And they would then like change me and do all sorts of things. And it was very funny and a little bit stressful, but mostly funny. And then I went into the makeup room, and the makeup guy was this very flamboyant gay man who had done makeup on Broadway for a long time. He was really fun. We had a great time. And I told him, please make my makeup as natural as possible, because I just didn't want to be like super made up. And he was very good. He was like, don't worry, love, we'll make you perfect. And I was like, oh, that's so nice. It was just really fun. And then I went to the hair lady. I will just say, in a very petty way, I was not very happy with my hair. Who cares? That's not the important part. So that was the lead up to the taping. Is that a fun story?
Rather interesting, actually. And the fact that you mentioned you almost didn't go on the show because they couldn't find someone to really debate you, which I think is a major compliment, to be honest. Like, so many people are actually scared to really speak what they believe in. But clearly you've got more on your side than they do, which I find really interesting, that they do not like having conversations. They try and shut people up that are on the opposing side, let's say on the side of sanity and science and biology. They try and get rid of those people by just saying, we're going to cancel you. We're not even going to engage, which I think is just stupid, if you ask me, but not a sign of a healthy society. So how do you feel about people that are part of the transgender community that don't want to actually have a conversation with you?
I took it exactly the way that you just described. I mean, when she said, I can't find anyone to debate you, it's like, well, yeah, you know, this is why we radical feminists who oppose gender identity can't be heard, right? You know, if people, do you and your audience know who Chase Strangio is?
My audience may know, but I don't.
Okay, so Chase Strangio is a lawyer at the ACLU. Full disclosure, I worked at the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, between 2012 and 2014 on criminal justice policies. I did not work on things related to sex and gender. I worked on the US's problem with mass incarceration and police militarization. And I left at the very end of 2014 for personal reasons, having nothing to do with this topic that we're talking about. There's a lawyer who joined the ACLU, I believe in 2013, and I'm going to refer to her as her. And her name is Chase, and she considers herself to be a man. And she came on to be the deputy director of transgender justice at the ACLU. So Chase and I overlapped at the ACLU by, I don't know, something like 6 months to a year or something. I don't really know, because I never met her, I don't think, while I was working there. But in any event, Chase knows who I am. I know who Chase is. Chase and I have exchanged email messages in the context of the nation happening in the US. Chase has gone on tweet storms accusing me of all manner of things. And I would like to go on a show like Bill Maher. I don't know if you guys know who Bill Maher is, but
Love Bill
so
Maher.
he's a fairly well-known American. Yeah. So I would love to go on a show with Bill Maher with Chase and have this conversation. And I don't think Chase would do it. You know, I would love to have the conversation. Let's have more debate. Let's have more, not even debate. You know, we don't even have to debate. Let's just discuss. Let's just talk about it.
Well, debate these days is not really debate. It becomes like this.
I don't even need to debate, because if you say debate, what the trans movement will say is, I'm not going to debate my existence. That's what they'll say. And the thing is, no one's debating anyone's existence. There are 8 billion people or so on the face of this planet. We all exist. No one's debating that. Every single one of us is either female or male, period, stop. So I don't want to talk, I don't want to frame it in terms of, I'm just interested in discussion. Let's have more discussion, not less discussion about these topics.
I think it was Rowan Atkinson that said the solution to freedom of speech, or the problems that we've got happening at the moment with cancel culture, is not to cancel speech, it's more speech. We should be talking more about these topics, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. I'm a free speech absolutist. We may not like what a person has said, doesn't mean we should stop a person from saying it because we disagree or don't like them. The transgender group are this protected characteristic group, according to YouTube. That's their own policy. I'm like, why are they protected but normal human beings are not? Like, they're so special for some reason. What makes them so special? And when they go, I don't want to debate my existence, I'm like, well, what does it mean to really exist? If you can define that and explain that to me, by all means. But they won't. They don't even know, because they're trying to fight for their so-called existence, but they don't even really know or believe for 1 second that they exist, because it all comes down to this one ideology that they're believed in, which I think is fascinating.
It is fascinating. And a good friend of mine, her name is Saba Malik, and she once gave a talk where she said, if I thought that your disagreement with me negated my existence, I would be a very insecure person.
100%.
Right? If anyone's disagreement with each other negated the other person's existence, then none of us would exist.
I think
it makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And I think a lot of people these days are really soft. I think we've created a soft-minded society, especially the transgender group of people. Like, they're a small little minority group, and somehow some people within positions of power have gone, oh, because you're a minority group and you've got a loud voice, we're going to listen to you and we're going to create this safe space for you. Who are anyone to disagree on the fact that you somehow exist or don't exist or whatever else it is, because you claim it to be so? Like, I can claim whatever the hell I want.
I do want to say, I don't think that there's a group here. There's no coherent group of people called trans people. It just doesn't exist as a coherent group of people. Every single person who claims to have a trans identity is either female or male. Just like every single person who calls herself or himself, oh, I don't want to be disrespectful here. I don't want to be disrespectful of religion. So let me take it out of religion. Every single American Democrat is either female or male. Every single American Republican is either female or male. every single Christian is either female or male. Every single Jewish person is either female or male. You know, every single any group you can have, all of us are either female or male. But there's no group that isn't made up of female and male people. None. So I don't even like to talk about trans as a group. And a lot of the people who show up to rallies, we haven't even gotten into like the violence that women face when we speak out about our rights, but a lot of the people who show up to oppose women speaking out about our rights, as happened in Melbourne, has happened later in Auckland, New Zealand, with Posey Parker visiting our country and New Zealand. Yeah. A lot of them don't complain to be trans themselves. They're just shouting a bunch of things into their megaphones, basically. I'm sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent.
No, I like it because I agree. Like, I think when I see a bunch of people that gather together within their own little group, let's say, and then they believe the same thing and they shout to the rooftops, they become extremely violent and they trample on women. They don't care about women, yet they claim that they want to be like women, which, like, why in the world are you trampling on real women for? And then they come up with these pathetic and ridiculous labels. I cannot stand cis. It narcs me and sends me up the wrong way. It really does. Because what is the point? And then they will say assigned at birth. No. Don't tell me that I was assigned at birth. No, I was born male. Leave it at that. Don't tell me I was assigned by somebody. A doctor assigned me being male. I was conceived. At the moment of conception, I was given male. XY chromosome. That's science, but they won't go with that. They're trying to, for whatever reason, remove science from the equation. And if you say anything against that, you're considered to be hateful. I'm like, how is that hateful? The truth is now hateful. Like, and now women are hateful too for speaking the truth. So we're going backwards.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that you said there, but I've been called a Nazi more times than I can count. And I've never practiced Judaism, but probably a lot of people can tell from looking at me that I have Ashkenazi heritage. It's all on my dad's side. So I'm not religiously Jewish, but my father's ancestors came from Eastern Europe, and they were Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews. And my grandmother, my father's mother, was an absolutely devout Jew. And for someone to call me, and I was very close to her. She died in 2007. And I was very, very close to her. She called me Carabelle and Carola. She had so many sort of lovely pet names for me. And I miss her dearly. And she was also very strict and very strict, I would say, in a good way. She was I want to say traditional, but she wasn't a traditional grandmother in the sense that, like, she didn't cook very much. She just thought that it was important for society to have values and ethics. And she taught me piano, and she was herself a teacher and then a principal, and she cared about women advancing in the world. And she taught me so much about how to be a woman in the world. And she was this Jewish woman born of an immigrant. Her mother was an immigrant from Ukraine. And I just don't know how you're going to call me a Nazi. I just don't understand. I don't understand. My grandmother's mother, who I remember, my great grandmother died when I was like 7 or 8 or something. She was fleeing the pogroms in Ukraine. How are you going to call me a Nazi? I don't understand, but they do.
And they call actual Jewish people Nazis, believe it or not. So they call whoever goes against them and their ridiculous ideology, they call them whatever they want. You're a transphobe, you're a bigot, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist, you're everything, according to them. But we ain't. So get lost almost. Just, yeah.
Yeah.
Just be quiet, please. And yeah, stop it. It's getting really, really annoying. I'm sick and tired of the level of insanity. There was this video that I shared on social media of this so-called sexuality expert or parenting expert, self-proclaimed, obviously, got pink hair. Obviously, you've got the pronouns and everything else that goes along with it. I'm like, great. I thank God I was not raised by that woman or whatever they choose to identify as, because get this, she was saying on live TV that babies, before changing the nappies, the baby has to give you consent first. Otherwise, it is abuse to that child. I know, right? Yes, that was my reaction. And the reporter that was doing the report, you could see that she was literally holding back like tears of laughter because the absolute absurdity. And she was the so-called sexual expert was saying a child gives you consent, like you're meant to wait a couple of seconds, and when the baby nods their head, then you can go in and you can change their nappy for them. And I'm going, what the hell? And this is a actual segment, believe it or not. She's teaching this stuff, but that's the level of insanity that goes on these days is just absolutely absurd, and people go along with it. I'm like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. A good friend of mine is a woman named Jennifer Billick who runs something called the 11th Hour blog. And she's on Twitter a lot using hashtag stay human. It just hashtag stay human, like stay human. In the face of this relentless nonsense. I mean, I was 13 years old when my brother was born, and by the time I was in high school, my parents were going off having Saturday night dates, and they were leaving me to babysit my little brother. All fine, all good, la la la. I had to do the chores, I had to do the laundry, like I had responsibilities in the house, and one of the things was babysitting my brother. And like, what? I had to ask his permission before. God.
My hashtag would be stay sane, please. For the love of God, just stay sane. We need more sane people. And the thing is, like, when you are speaking up, and you can even see, like, I think the tide is changing a little bit because the level of just absolute insanity that's going on and being, produced on a global platform, like you don't have to look too far on Twitter. You look at the Twitter comments, or even on TikTok, which is the bane of all humanity. Again, you look at the comments section and what people are saying, and a vast majority of them are going, "You are stupid." There is something wrong with you. A friend of mine actually was saying to me not that long ago, because we need to declare a war on weird. Like, we just need to call things for what they really are. It's weird. And we need to push it aside and say, weird people and weirdness, go over here, please, and not at the forefront of society and take over. Let's leave sane society as it is. Please. Yeah.
So bringing together a couple of topics, being weird and Bill Maher. We were talking about Bill Maher a little bit ago. And then if we could, I want to say a few things about my book coming
Please
up.
Please do. Yep. Go for it.
Okay. But Bill Maher did this amazing episode in 2019 going into the 2020 presidential elections. And it's beautiful. I need to say, I've got some major problems with Bill Maher, but setting those aside, This 2019 thing he did was perfect. And what he said was to all the Democratic candidates, he was talking to Elizabeth Warren, who wanted to use federal taxpayer money to give federal prisoners, what she referred to as gender affirming surgeries.
Mm.
She basically wanted to use taxpayer money to cut men's parts off.
Yep. We've got that here in Australia now.
We're doing it now. Actually, we're doing it now. She got her way. Kamala Harris, who introduced herself at a presidential town hall, announcing her pronouns, and a guy named Julian Castro, who's a former mayor of San Antonio, Texas, I think, and he wanted to talk about the importance of abortion rights for transgender women. Now, think about that phrase for a second. If you are someone who supports transgender women, you need to understand that that phrase refers to men. And there's no need to talk about abortion rights for transgender women. And so Bill Maher just lashed into all of them and said, stop being weird. Literally, stop being weird. All you have to do, this is him, right? All you have to do is be less crazy than Donald Trump. Why are you struggling with this? This is what Bill Maher was saying to the Democratic candidates for president in 2019, and he was totally right. Stop being weird.
So here's a funny question for you. Do you think that a lot of these people on the Democratic side are becoming more weird than Donald Trump at the moment?
That's a really good question. That's a very hard question because the orange guy is under, I don't even know how many indictments at this point.
I think he's up to his fourth now.
Fourth complaint, but each complaint includes, I think, numerous charges. So, and I'm going to have to go fairly quickly, but let me use that great point to segue into my book. Can I talk about my book a little bit?
Please, I would love to.
All right. So in 2021, I published a book called The Abolition of Sex, and that was basically to make the case that all of gender identity, all of transgender, is basically about abolishing the material reality of sex in the law. And my main audience for that was mainstream American liberals, to give them a vocabulary to talk about this, because I am not right-wing. I am not a registered Republican. I have always been a registered Democrat, except for when I was a Green. And we just need to break this issue open in American society. And I know you do too in Australia. I don't mean to discount that, but let me just pause for a second. Thank you so much for letting me talk to your Australian audience. I know I'm just an American weirdo, but
no, you're not.
So my next book is going to talk about why I think and how I can document that the Democrats in power and the entire American left knows exactly what it's doing. I've been tracking this since 2015. I can talk about how radical feminists have been telling the Democrats since 2016 exactly how bad this is for women and girls, how bad it is for lesbians and gay men, how bad it is for kids. I can document exactly when and where we've told Democrats in positions of power all along the way. And they're going ahead with it anyway. They're not misguided. They're not confused. They know what they're doing. And they also know, going into the 2024 election cycle, how unpopular all of this is with the American electorate. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I don't care. The vast majority of Americans know that this is nonsense. It's very unpopular. And the Democrats are going full speed ahead with it anyway. But at some point, they're going to get a clue and they're going to realize how unpopular it is. And my worry is that they're going to backtrack. They're going to try to pretend that this never happened. They're going to try to pretend that they never housed men in women's prisons. They're going to try to pretend that they never allowed men to compete in women's sports. They're going to try to pretend that they never advocated for the sterilization and mutilation of children's bodies. And I don't want them to get away with it. And that is my own party leadership I'm talking about. And that book should come out in the next couple months.
Do you have a title for the book?
A title? The Reckoning. How the Democrats and the left betrayed women and girls.
That gave me chills. The Reckoning. I love it. I'm going to have to bring you back on again, Cara, to talk about your book. I think that would be fantastic because I agree with you wholeheartedly that there is this plan, as it were, in place. And you're right. I feel the same thing. I feel like they're just going to go, well, we didn't do anything wrong. We weren't doing this. Like, yeah, right. We've got evidence. So you can deny until you're blue in the face. Doesn't mean that you're right again. So anyway, thank you so much, Cara, once again for your time and your wisdom and your sanity. It's a refreshing part of my life at the moment. I need it. So to be continued, I guess.
Thanks so much for having me. I do really appreciate it. And I'm just this weird American. What can I say?